There is a monument in Dublin to Charles Stewart Parnell, who was a 19th century Irish politician who memorably said, "No man has the right to say to his country, 'Thus far shalt thou go, and no further.'" Now, Parnell was talking in 1885 about British rule in Ireland. But after independence, a different set of boundaries arose. The 1937 Constitution was in effect Ireland's religious Berlin Wall, with its declaration that all authority comes from the Most Holy Trinity, and its reference to us humbly acknowledging our obligations to our divine Lord Jesus Christ. Yesterday's historic vote for marriage equality has started the fall of Ireland's religious Berlin Wall. Finally, love and hope have burst through the boundaries of fear and control that were put in stone 80 years ago in Ireland. As the first country in the world to endorse marriage equality for gay people by popular vote of the people, Ireland can never again be seen as a repressive Catholic state. I'm looking forward to flying back home tomorrow to a better Ireland, a more compassionate Ireland and a more equal Ireland than the island that I flew out from on Friday to come to here after voting. But the marriage equality vote wasn't the only significant event in Ireland last week. In 1979, in a seaside village in County Sligo in Ireland, the IRA blew up a fishing boat and murdered the elderly English Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was the great-uncle of Prince Charles of England, along with Baroness Doreen Brabourne and two children aged 14 and 15. It was one of the more significant murders of the IRA campaign in Ireland. This week, a few short decades later, Prince Charles of England visited Ireland, visited the site of that atrocity, and later on his visit to Ireland he shook hands with Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, two of the leaders of the IRA who had murdered his great-uncle back in Sligo. And like the marriage equality vote, those handshakes would have been considered unthinkable just a short period ago. Like the marriage equality referendum, it was a referendum in 1998 that formalised a change in Irish thinking that had been bubbling under the surface for years, when overwhelmingly 94% of the Irish people endorsed in referendum the Belfast Agreement that ended the euphemistically described troubles in Northern Ireland. The marriage equality referendum, as I mentioned yesterday when I was talking about the result, also in a way had its roots in violence. In 1982, in a quiet park in Dublin, a gay man called Declan Flynn was beaten to death by a gang of self-declared queer bashers, and when they were taken to court, the judge found them they were found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder. The judge made reference to them trying to clean up the area. Back in those days, homosexual acts were actually illegal in Ireland. And they were given a suspended sentence, and they had a victory march back to Fairview Park. That resulted in a large protest march organised by the gay community in Ireland, and that gradually evolved into what is today's annual Pride Parade in Dublin, a celebration of the gay community in Ireland and of their relationship with the straight community in Ireland, and ultimately led to the referendum that has changed Ireland so historically. I still don't really fully appreciate until I go back home the importance of that. But I would like to ask, what I'm hoping to address today in a way that will also be relevant to other countries, is what has caused those momentous changes in Ireland, from an Ireland of terrorism and religious bigotry to an Ireland where, despite those problems not yet being resolved, we can at least look forward to the future with optimism. And much of it has been just the inevitable tide of history that in the developing world, democracy is causing countries to become more peaceful and secular through things like education, pluralism, communications technology. It's happening all around the world. If you look at the World Values Survey, you'll find evidence that is a trend everywhere. But part of it has also been the organised campaigns by so many people on both sides of the border against terrorism and religious bigotry, and for democratic secular values. I don't for a moment believe that we as peace campaigners were responsible for bringing about the Belfast Agreement ourselves. I don't for a moment believe that we as secular campaigners are responsible directly for the marriage equality referendum. In both cases, I believe that what we were doing was reflecting a public mood that was bubbling away under the surface for years, and that it eventually found expression when accidents of history enabled it to do so. Because I think that that is how political change happens. We live in a world where, from the collapse of the Berlin Wall to the fall of apartheid in South Africa to yesterday's referendum result in Ireland, where momentous changes can happen very quickly that would have seemed unthinkable just a short time before they happen. And we don't know when those changes will happen, and we don't know what will trigger those changes. But we do know that when they do happen, that all of the work that we have been doing will retrospectively become useful, because we will have put in place the foundations that can be used to institutionalise the new changes that are happening, whatever caused them to happen. So today what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to share the 5 most important lessons that I have learned from my involvement in those campaigns over the decades, from chairing the peace and democracy group New Consensus back in the 1980s and 1990s to chairing the atheist and secular advocacy group Atheist Ireland in more recent years. Now, as an overview, I'm going to suggest that building just and peaceful and secular communities involves us treating ideas and behaviour differently than we treat people. We should robustly challenge harmful ideas and behaviour, but we should respect the people who hold those beliefs that we find harmful as people. More specifically, with regard to the theme of this conference, which is Give Peace a Chance in the context of secularism and conflict, I'm going to examine the following 5 steps for peaceful secularism. The first is stand up to violence. The second is seek respectful dialogue. The third is start with human rights. The fourth is be proactive in politics, and the fifth is to establish secular schools. Now, all of those 5 steps have been common to both of the major campaigns that we have been involved in Ireland. First of all, for peace and democracy and against terrorism, and more recently for secularism. And I hope that those lessons will be broad enough to be transferable to different situations in different countries, although I'll be articulating them in the context of Ireland.